All right, it is 12 o'clock, so I can officially now say good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining me at this very, very busy time of year as we round out our series on the top 10 noticings. Um, we are talking today about the top 10 noticings uh, in English 1 through 4 from our 2023 ELA standards. So we're going to go ahead and jump right in. Right, a little bit of housekeeping here. Starting off with some introductions. For those of you who have not had an opportunity to meet, hello, my name is Casey Prince Harvey, and I'm Education Associate for Humanities and ELA Support on the standards side of the Office of Assessment and Standards. And I'm joined today by my colleagues on the ELA team. I have Mandy Hawker, who is our Elementary Education Associate. I have Tabitha Hughes, our middle level ELA Education Associate, and then Brenna McCormick, who is our secondary ELA Education Associate, all on the standards side. And we have each taken turns over the last few weeks sharing those top 10 shifts in each of our grade bands. So hopefully you've had an opportunity to hear from each of us. But they are here in the chat. They're dropping links. They're going to be helping support this session throughout the day. So I'd love to hear who is in the virtual space with us today. So if you wouldn't mind dropping in the chat your name and where you are coming to us from, would love to see who we have today. And I'm seeing some familiar faces and I'm seeing some familiar names in the chat. So it's good to see that you're coming back. Very good. And I'm seeing also representation from across the state, up, down, side to side. That's always great to hear. And of course, some of our SCDE colleagues here as well. Very excited. All right. Well, if you have not added your introduction, feel free to go ahead and continue doing that, but I'll keep us on task by sharing our landing page. I think Brenna is going to drop that in the chat for you. We do have a landing page that has a variety of materials for today's session. It will have the link to the attendance, a participant copy of the slides, as well as a variety of resources that I'll share with you as we talk about not only those noticings, but also some instructional practices to support those noticings or shifts. So you'll definitely want to access the landing page, and then also the attendance. So we're going to also drop the attendance. That helps us to know who we're serving in the state, where we're having an impact, just so we have an idea of where our support is going and how it's supporting teachers and students. Last little piece of information, session recordings. So we are recording today's session, and with this being the top 10 shifts and some discussion about instructional practices, I want to make sure that we have enough time to share those resources and to hear from you if you have any questions or things that you want to share. So if for any reason our session we don't complete the slides by the end of our time today by 1 o'clock, I'll make sure we still honor our time. And wherever we are at 1 o'clock, I'll pause and then I'll just record any pieces that are left and share that with you in addition to the recording of the session that we're having right now live. So you'll get a recording of anything, including anything that we just don't have enough time to cover. One other piece here, as I talked about those instructional practices, I will share with you some resources and some strategies today, but those are going to be, one of many examples. So I do want to encourage you as well as you are thinking about those shifts and any noticings and what that could look like in instruction, to please make sure that you also consult your high quality instructional materials as part of your textbook adoption, to see what resources and what engagements are there to support student learning. All right. With all of that being said, I think we're going to move into our purpose today, which is to provide a lens for recognizing the most noticeable shifts, additions, and clarifications in our ELA standards for English 1 through English 4. And we're using the analogy of the lens because the lens focuses and clarifies what we see, and it enhances our understanding or perception of the image viewed through it. So we thought this was just a really helpful analogy when we're discussing how things can be clarified, ideas, concepts, or new perspectives. So whether that be the lens of a camera, where you can adjust and clarify, or even the lens of glasses. I love hearing stories where people, put on glasses for the first time and they can actually see the definition of, the blades of grass or the leaves on trees. So hopefully you walk away with a little bit of clarification today. So I want us to start with a quote, and this one is from Maya Angelou. You may be familiar with this quote, and it says, "I did then what I knew how to do. Now that I know better, I do better." So I want us to consider this quote through the lens of our new standards, and one of these three categories. So thinking about our standards, our new 2023 standards, drop in the chat how you think this quote might connect to planning, instruction, or assessment. So let's take about 30 seconds to drop in the chat how you think this quote might connect to one of those three categories. And I see, Mary, you said this is one of your favorite quotes. It's a good one. It's a powerful one. So yeah, any connections you can make to planning, instruction, or assessment with our new standards as it relates to the quote. Oh, I love that, Emily. Once you know how to do something better, you don't fall back on what you did before. Absolutely. Oh, Martina, making better decisions after analyzing results of assessment. Sandra, I like what you said too. Understanding the rigor and scope and sequence really helps to guide that instruction, right? That helps to guide the planning and the instruction and the assessment, right? Once you really know and understand. Mary, I like what you said too, not falling back on, well, we used to do X, Y, and Z, right? We don't always have to throw out the baby with the bathwater, of course, right? Some of the noticings here are just going to be clarifications. Some of it may be new. But yeah, we don't always have to fall back on what we've done in the past just because it's what we've done. Absolutely. Kristen, I love what you said. Better understanding of what the standards expect, can do better as you plan, create learning opportunities. Absolutely. And it's all about that intentionality. Love it. Well, let's move on forward here, talking about some of those noticings or shifts or clarifications. That's what the focus of today is going to be. We do have a link to an infographic that you'll get in the chat. You also have the QR code here if you want to access it through there. And it's also on your landing page. So lots of different ways that you can access it. But you'll see on the screen here the top 10 noticings for English 1 through 4 teachers. There's a separate document for each of the grade bands, and you'll see here the 10 that are listed on that document. This is in order of the standards, so it's not in order of importance. It's just the order that you would see them in the standards document, with the first 5 noticings being applications of reading, then into research, then into communications. And these were noticings or clarifications that we thought were important to share, but keep in mind, these are not the only 10 shifts or noticings in those standards. It's just an entry point. So with that, we'll move into those individual noticings, starting with applications of reading. So our first noticing here is going to be with application of reading 3.1, and that is on point of view and perspective. So the key piece of information to notice with AOR 3.1 is that point of view and perspective are now more clearly articulated and differentiated in our 2023 standards. So in the past, we may have seen those terms conflated in the field or they were used interchangeably. So we wanted to make sure that this was a very clear delineation for teachers. And when we look at it for high school, what we have here is our vertical progression. And I'm showing you starting at 8th grade, because what I want you to notice is that 8th grade is going to be the last time that students look explicitly at point of view in addition to perspective. So beginning in English 1, students are going to focus more specifically on differences in perspectives and how literary devices impact those perspectives. So we'll consider the definitions here of both point of view and perspective, because we can see here now there's a much clearer difference between the two. So both of these terms are going to be essential to the standards, but keeping in mind that the focus will begin to shift from what's on the left when we move into high school to what's on the right. And we can see how these shifts could look instructionally by looking at one of our pretty commonly taught texts in high school, which is There Will Come Soft Rains by Ray Bradbury. And you do have the link to this as well on your landing page. So we're going to talk about what you could do using this text as an example to address point of view and perspective, and really focusing on that perspective piece. So I have a couple of questions here. One being a question that you could ask about point of view, or a task that you could provide for students to address point of view. But then on the right, questions or prompts to engage in perspective. So on the left, we have point of view with identify the point of view in There Will Come Soft Rains by Ray Bradbury. Then on the right, we have two questions. First, how does Ray Bradbury build suspense through differences in perspective between the reader and the quote unquote characters in There Will Come Soft Rains? And why does Bradbury show instead of tell? So I want us to pause here and tell me in the chat, or feel free to unmute, what do you notice about the differences in complexity between these two sets of questions? What do you notice about differences in complexity?
Point of view is just pretty easy to pick out. It's easy to identify. Perspective, they actually have to read between the lines to figure it out.
Absolutely, absolutely. So we're looking at more of an identification and something that you could just sort of pick out. It could be provided for you even, right? Like, it's this or it's this. But when we look at perspective, you really are having to read between the lines a little bit and move more so into that analysis and even into evaluation. So here are two additional examples. And I want you to consider the question on the left in addition to the question on the right. So we look at the question for point of view. How does the point of view in There Will Come Soft Rains impact the story? Now we're moving up a little bit in complexity. And then the question on the right, analyze the differences in perspective between Bradbury as the author of the short story and Sara Teasdale as the author of the poem referenced within the story. So I want you to think here about how the question on the left supports and scaffolds the questions on the right. And feel free to drop in the chat again. How does the one on the left support what we then do on the right? Impact is prepping minds for analysis. Absolutely. And what I think is helpful to keep in mind here, right, is those questions for point of view While they're not directly addressed in English 1 through 4, they do provide an entry point for the work around perspective, right? So this is where students may need to start out to get them to where they need to go with that complexity around perspective. But I also want us to consider what would happen if we only ever lived in point of view. If we only ever thought about, is this first person point of view? Is it third person point of view versus the perspective of the author or characters within the story? What would happen if we only ever lived in that point of view side? And again, feel free to drop in the chat.
Flat growth, you wouldn't really get to analysis of anything.
Absolutely, absolutely. And like with this question here for point of view, it's starting to, get towards analysis, but there's so much more depth when you consider the perspectives of characters and authors, not just who's telling the story, but why are they telling the story in the way that they do? What are they saying? What are they not saying? How does it impact? Right? There's so much more there. Absolutely. So another example of how you might address differences in perspective, because really that's what you're looking at when you move into high school, is how do those differences in perspective create things like suspense or surprise or even humor. Another example would be The Wife Story by Ursula K. Le Guin. Really great one if you're wanting to talk about how a narrator builds suspense. I have it linked in your landing page if you're just wanting another resource that you could go back to and go through some of those similar questions to address perspective. But now we'll shift from point of view and perspective in literary text to perspective and purpose in informational text. So I have a couple of things highlighted here in different colors, and we're going to kind of talk about each one. And this is looking now at 2023 compared to 2015. So from 2015 to 2023, you'll notice a few key shifts when it comes to perspective and purpose. So the first shift would be the shift in complexity. So those items that are in yellow are going to show you the differences in complexity, whereas in English 1 with 2015, students were identifying and analyzing. Now they're moving into analysis, and then in English 2, moving into evaluation as well. So the complexity in purpose and perspective and informational text has started to up a little bit. But then also, you have those items in blue. That's going to be in shift in language. So we'll see on the right side with 2015 that point of view was the term that was used when addressing informational text. And then on the left with 2023, we're now focusing again on that perspective piece. The last thing that I wanted to note here on this particular slide is that piece that's in red that says cite significant textual evidence or cite strong and thorough textual evidence, which you don't see on the left with 2023. And that's because citing evidence and that inference piece is now a part of our overarching expectations. So they're no longer standalone standards or indicators. They're really embedded into the work that students are doing across those multiple strand standards and indicators. I've also included here, now that we're saying perspective as opposed to point of view in those informational texts, I've included the segment of the definition for perspective for informational text. So it's going to be an author or speaker's unique attitude toward a topic or perception of an issue or event. And that perspective is going to affect how that information is written or spoken about. Same thing here as we continue to English 3 and 4, you'll again see that shift in complexity, moving from just determining to then evaluating. But then you'll also notice in blue here that in 2023, students are now expected to look at 2 or more texts on the same topic by authors with differing perspectives. So again, that complexity really has shifted in terms of what students are expected to do. So one way that students can look at multiple perspectives on the same topic Could be through something like op-ed pieces, letters to the editor on current events, anything where we might have a pretty familiar topic where there are going to be multiple perspectives. So I have an example here of 2 articles, both written on the topic of student mental health days. And you'll have access to this so you can open those up and take a look at them. But one is going to be that mental health days for students are dangerous. And then the other is going to be a series of segments from students talking about the importance of mental health days. So those perspectives are going to be a little bit different. So what you could do with this is use something like this. So, a graphic organizer or question stems or prompts to invite students to look critically at each author's perspective. So starting with that issue, followed by what each source thinks about the issue, what could cause the author to believe that, and then moving into some of that rhetoric with the moves that the authors make, how those moves impact the audience, and whether or not those moves are effective and why or why not. And that's where we're really getting into that evaluation piece. Then you can invite students in conclusion to determine which position they would take and why. So similarly here, because we touched a little bit on rhetoric just a second ago, thinking about application of reading 5.3, that's going to be our piece on argument and rhetoric. So while the previous indicator was focused on perspective from the author or speaker, now we're looking really more specifically at rhetoric. And so before we begin looking at high school, it's really important to see how rhetoric is supported in earlier grades, because this is a pretty significant shift for all of our grade bands with the 2023 standards, where rhetoric is now introduced at an earlier level. So I want to talk a little bit about how we get to where we are in high school, going all the way back to kindergarten. So let's start with some of our different skills and content that students are learning, again, beginning all the way in kindergarten. So we see that these are introduced with students identifying an opinion, moving into determining, the difference between facts and opinions, looking at reasons, claim, evidence, argument. All of that is done in elementary school. So we move up to 5th grade. Students are determining an author's argument, but in addition to that, they're tracing the development of the author's argument, which is really important because this is the skill that is going to continue into the middle level grades and all 3 middle level grades. And when we say trace the development of the argument, I'm pulling a little bit from our glossary here with what it means to trace. So let's pause here and take a look at that. Consider that definition and tell me in the chat what might be important to notice with that definition. What all is included in that definition? Why might it be important that students are going to be spending really 4 years tracing the development of an author's argument? Share any takeaways in the chat as you're looking at that definition. All right, Mary, I see, yep, identifying, examining, evaluating, counterclaims, transition. It really is a culmination to everything. There are so many components to tracing the development of an author's argument. Absolutely. So that is something that students could very well need an extensive amount of time on where they're really getting into the nitty-gritty. It's complex. There are a lot of layers. Definitely takes time to hone that overall skill. Absolutely, absolutely. Which then leads us into middle school. So when students move into 6th grade, they're going to continue tracing the development of the author's argument. And you can see it actually all the way up through 8th grade. They'll continue doing that. But in 6th grade, that's where rhetoric is formally introduced through the identification of the types of reasoning and rhetorical appeal. So now we're actually naming it, right? Now students, those skills were built up from the previous grades, but now we're actually naming it. We see that this is in bold here because this is new content. But in future grades, 7th and 8th grade, we don't have any bolded terms. That's because this is the only true new content that's introduced. And what's happening is that the complexity of the skills is going to move. So in 6th grade, you'll see they're identifying. Then in 7th, they're going to explain. And then in 8th grade, they're going to analyze. So keep all of that in mind and think back to that definition of trace. What do you notice about that new content or skills? Or why might it be important that students are going to have, again, those 3 years to not only trace, but now we're looking at those components of rhetoric and moving in terms of complexity? Does that sort of affirm what you said previously? Absolutely. Students who can trace and analyze can apply in their own writing. Yes, absolutely, absolutely, right? We want that, I mean, what we might say in earlier grades, that decoding and that encoding, right? It's sort of that same piece as that input and that output. And the skills are definitely going to take time, especially if we want these to be done well. We want students to really have those tools in their toolbox. Absolutely. So again, you see that identifying, explaining, analyzing, that's the progression that we're going to see. Not necessarily new content, but we're going deeper instead of wider. So then once students enter high school, you see that the complexity of skills is going to increase from evaluating the effectiveness of reasoning and rhetoric to then comparing, then evaluating, and then we're evaluating and critiquing multiple arguments on the same topic. So again, you really get to go deeper into that content as opposed to having to focus on new content, new skill. So that means that high school teachers can be much more intentional about their instruction because the students are going to have exposure to that content and skills in the earlier grades. And this also provides an opportunity for students to gain confidence in their knowledge, which could lead to them, even taking some more academic risks of, enrolling in AP Lang if they wanted to, or, by the time they graduate, they have those skills in place to be able to navigate messages around around whatever's happening in their world. So that overall shift in complexity is even more clear when we look at the end of learning expectation for 2023 compared to 2015. So if you take a look, here's our English 4 end of learning expectation in 2023 versus 2015. So what do you notice about the difference and where students are going to end up in terms of their ability to analyze arguments and look at rhetoric and consider differing opinions or perspectives? What do you notice in comparison to 2015? Sandra, I see your message. Really need to focus on teaching to the rigor of the standard in order for students to develop skills. For sure. Do we see an end goal here that's a little bit more complex? I mean, I'm just looking even at the verbs here, right? We're analyzing, we're determining, but then in 2023, we're evaluating and critiquing. And again, it's those multiple arguments on the same topic, right? You're having to look at all of those different pieces in order to make a decision or provide some sort of evaluation that includes all those different components. Mary, it's like a combination of the two 2015 moving further with complexity. Absolutely. So we've already kind of said that. How has rhetoric shifted from 2015 to 2023? We see definitely a shift in complexity. These next two questions, though, I want you to think about. How will that shift impact students? And then how will that shift impact instructional practices? So how is that going to be, impactful for students, but also what are teachers going to have to do in order to adjust to that shift? Oh, rigor, rigor, rigor. Absolutely.
They're going to have to bring their A game. That's what I see. I'm just saying. But you know what? I think that a lot of them probably have always wanted to do all of this, but never found time in the schedule to do it. But
Mm-hmm.
now that the standards are more condensed, they can go deeper. I mean, a lot of people
Absolutely.
always have wanted to go deeper and didn't have the time. That's just my
Mm-hmm.
opinion.
Yeah, for sure. And I will say from my background is teaching high school English. Um, my English 1 and 2 students, we were looking at the rhetorical triangle and what is ethos, pathos, logos. Can you identify, if I give you an example, can you identify it on the triangle? But now really, really, you can look at multiple arguments. You can provide that opportunity to really think critically about those messages and how they share them. Oh, Amanda, you spoke my love language. Getting to know the standards and utilizing the glossary. Yes, the glossary is one of those really helpful tools for making sure that you know the intent of that indicator language, because it really was crafted to align to the language of our indicators. It is on the landing page, by the way, because I was pulling some of the definitions as we were talking. So it is on there for you. Oh, and I love that, Nadine, explicit modeling so students know what it looks like to be successful. Teachers will also most likely need to use the vertical articulation. I'm so glad that you mentioned that. One of the great things about our 2023 standards is there is a strong vertical articulation, and it's Appendix B of our standards document is going to give you that vertical articulation for all of those standards, K through English 4, so you can see where skills or content is introduced and how it develops over time to get students to that end of learning goal. Yeah. And Martina, that is the next piece there, right? That vertical articulation is going to be so helpful in identifying where some of those shifts are and how we can meet students where they are to get them to where they need to be and where they're going to go. Because this is one of those that is going to be quite a shift where rhetoric was previously introduced in high school. It's now formally introduced in 6th grade. So that's going to be a learning curve for teachers as well as students. So that vertical articulation is going to be especially important there to support your students and your teachers. So speaking of some instructional practice, I have a video here. I'm not going to play it, but it is on here, so you can go back and watch it if you want. But similar to what we previously discussed, at the high school level, students, are going to evaluate those multiple arguments on the same topic. And they can do that through, again, those op-eds, those letters to the editor, formal debates. So the example that I'll have on here is going to be one author, and they've created a guide to the debate around banning TikTok. We know that's a pretty big news piece right now. So while this isn't going to be a text from separate authors, it is going to provide information about both sides as an entry point for student discussion. But you could always literally pull a debate, or you could take two different pieces written on that same topic and go through some of these same questions. So let me pause it. There we go. So you could have students explore the claims that are made on each side and whether or not those claims are valid. Have students determine how each side tries to win their debate and consider that reasoning and rhetoric that's used. And then that evaluation piece. If you were a judge, which side would you go with and why? and what could the other side do to make their argument more effective? If you had to give them some sort of critique, what could they do? So just a couple of pieces there for exploring. We have some additional support for rhetoric, since again, that shift is truly a shift for all of those grade bands and levels. We have a rhetoric support document as well as supplements. So those are going to be your ethos, pathos, logos supplement, your types of reasoning supplement, your rhetorical devices supplement, and your rhetorical triangle supplement. So each of those are like a little 1 to 2 pager, in addition to the overall rhetoric support document that walks you through many of these shifts that we've discussed. In addition, I hosted a webinar on rhetoric in October, and that is posted on our professional learning library, but I've also included the link to the YouTube recording on your landing page. So if you just want to go back and familiarize yourself with any of what we've discussed, maybe even go a little bit more in depth, that is on your landing page. So that was a lot about rhetoric. So we'll go ahead and shift over to AOR 6.1, which is summarizing and paraphrasing, which wouldn't seem like it's a huge shift, but it is important to note that summary and paraphrase is now a standalone standard and indicator in our 2023 standards, whereas in 2015, it was embedded in indicators around theme and central idea. So your RL and RI 6.1 had that summary piece embedded in it. Now they're going to be standalone skills. And I've got the definitions here from the glossary. Again, always go back to the glossary. So let's look at E1 through E4 with summarizing and paraphrasing. Again, I know it doesn't look like there's much of a shift here. And you can see that the language doesn't really change from English 1 through English 4. But what I want to point out here is that piece about enhancing comprehension. So summarizing is meant to lead to analysis, so it should be a strategy to enhance the comprehension of text. So as a result, the skills of summarizing and paraphrasing really are more important than ever, because it's what do you do with that summary. So previous grade levels, that vertical articulation we talked about, previous grade levels will explicitly outline what pieces of information are meant to be included in summaries before that skill gets reinforced in high school. So in previous grade levels, summary is meant to include plot, theme, and central idea, and key ideas or key details and supporting details. So what that means at the high school level then is summary becomes the support for analysis or metacognition. In other words, the who, what, when, and where, which is the summary, are the starting point for the why and the how, which is that analysis and metacognition piece. So some ways that teachers at the high school level can reinforce the skill of summarizing and using it as a platform for that analysis and metacognition piece would be through something like a gist statement. So a gist statement is just a summary strategy where students create a 20-word summary. And gist stands for generating interactions between schemata and text. So for this activity, students read a short piece of text and they create that 20-word summary using your 5 W and 1 H questions, your who, what, where, when, why, and how. So using that limited number of words then requires students to be very intentional about what information is included in that gist statement. So that's sort of that initial piece of creating that summary. But again, once students create that summary, teachers then have the opportunity to expand and use those summaries to aid in comprehension and to allow for that deeper analysis. So one way that you could use that summary piece as a launch pad would be through something like your Say Mean Matter. And this. I like you. I love you. There a question? Okay. Um, so this is just one activity that allows students to use their summaries as that jumping off point for the deeper learning. So we would start with what the text says, and that's where they would use that intentional gist statement or some other sort of summary. Then moving into the mean with what is your interpretation or what meaning can you draw from that statement? And then the matter, what is the significance of that information and how does the information impact the audience's understanding? So that's just one example. But the main focus here is for them to reach conclusions around each of those categories. Another example would be what, so what, now what. So it's just another strategy that again allows students to further explore their text after they've done that summary. So you'll see here similar questions, but the main difference between these two strategies is the what, so what, now what will allow students to explore actionability. So with that end piece of the now what can I do with this learning? This strategy could be really helpful for students who are using their summary to create a final product, like a research project, or maybe they are writing an argumentative piece and they need to build that into their call to action. And both could be adapted in terms of the product or the purpose. It's really the process of considering those questions that's the main goal, and taking that summary and using it to further explore. So again, not just writing the summary for the sake of writing the summary, but using it as an aid for comprehension and analysis. All right, AOR 8.1, word meaning within text. So when we look at AOR 8.1, we see that students are expected to interpret an author's use of figurative, connotative, and technical language in literary, informational, and multimedia texts. Much of the content here is going to be similar with 2015. We know that figurative language is not completely new to our students, but an important noticing for AOR 8.1 is that each grade level here is going to have specific examples of figures of speech. So it's going to be important to ensure students have exposure to those concepts at each of those grade levels. So I'm moving backwards here, but English 4, we see irony is one of the examples. In English 3, we see understatement. Same thing, English 2 with hyperbole, English 1 with pun. So just ensuring that students have access to, that example of a figure of speech. So one way that we can explore this instructionally would be going back to that example that I previously used of there will come soft rains. So what teachers could do here to explore AOR 8.1 would be to invite students to take a look more intentionally at the use of specific words and phrases that are used within both the short story, which is the little sample that's on the left here, and then within the short story, there's a poem, and looking at both of those pieces. So the first thing that we could do is look at the reference to dawn on both examples. So we see dawn showed faintly in the east in the short story on the left, and spring herself, when she awoke at dawn, would scarcely know that we were gone on the right. Students could explore how that word choice impacts meaning within both of those texts. And then what about the highlighted portion here we have in blue? And not one will know of the war, not one will care at last when it is done. We could explore irony here. Or even the title itself, the title of the short story and the title of the poem both being There Will Come Soft Rains, right? And consider that intentional use of language. All of these could be opportunities for students to explore or discuss or share their thinking around the impact that the intentional choice of language can have. And again, I know I'm using an example that we previously talked about with There Will Come Soft Rains, but that's also a reminder that text can be used and revisited for multiple purposes. So we could use There Will Come Soft Rains for AOR 3.1. We could use it for AOR 8.1. We can go back to it. We don't have to only use certain texts for certain skills. All right. Last, noticing for applications of reading is AOR 10.1, print and non-print forms. So this one, it's pretty clear why this would be noticing. It's because it's a new indicator with our 2023 standards. This is something that students really are doing for the first time with our standards, which is looking at the advantages and disadvantages of using different multimedia. So one way that students could analyze, evaluate, and critique the advantages or disadvantages of different types of media would be through something like ekphrastic poetry. And ekphrastic poetry is poetry that is written about works of art. So I've got an example here, pretty famous example with, on the left, the painting Landscape with the Fall of Icarus, and then on the right, the poem Landscape with the Fall of Icarus, written about the painting. And the painting, of course, being based on the myth of Icarus. So what you could do here is invite students to consider how both texts present that myth of Icarus. Consider what details are included or not included in each piece, and how what's included or not included could impact the meaning. Students could consider which text is more effective in telling its story and why. And as an extension, students could create their own ekphrastic poems based on a work of art. So they could, go explore a different work of art, select it, and write their own ekphrastic poem, which would hit communication 3. So they're writing, but again, it's also an extension where students are exploring that advantage or disadvantage of different types of media. Another example here would be to use articles, videos, or photo essays. So here we have 2 pieces, both written about the USC women's basketball undefeated season, and they're winning the 2024 NCAA women's basketball title. So one is going to be a video that's a cinematic recap of that season, and then the text on the right is going to be an article that was written about it that has some photos, but definitely a difference in terms of how the information is shared with the audience. And again, similar questions. How do both texts present the information? What are the advantages or disadvantages of telling this same story in different mediums? Which one is most effective in telling its story? And same thing here, as an extension, students could research other stories told in multiple mediums and evaluate the effectiveness of each piece. I'm going to pause and ponder there because I know that was a lot. What is one piece of information or insight from this first portion that either you gathered or had affirmed? I would love to see in the chat just one thing that you gathered or you had affirmed in this section as we explored some of those shifts. I'm just looking back at the chat. Oh, I'm glad to see some of you have used some of this, some of these resources before, which hopefully that's something that's affirming to you, that these could still be used as a way to meet those goals for our new standards. It's important for teachers to note shifts so instruction can also shift. And we've had some conversation about that. I think we're going to have, and Brenda, you can correct me if I'm wrong, this is going to be one of our summer webinars on the idea that the shifts, really are worth noting, that it's not just similar enough. That's really the focus there. Just to say, oh, it's not too different, so I'm just going to keep doing the same thing I've always done. Oh, April, I love what you said, being really intentional to guide teachers through the process. Oh, I'm so glad, Martina, it affirmed the rollout of the work that you've done so far. The figurative language specificity, absolutely, absolutely. I'm so glad. I'm so glad that you were either able to pull something new or have something affirmed in this first section, which I know was a lot. Really, the whole first portion Oh, Mary, makes you want to go back to teaching English. I had so much fun pulling some of these examples and strategies because it just hits that part of your brain that, um, you know, it's just nice.
Well,
Just
I
really
mean,
nice.
I was a middle and high school English teacher for pretty
Mhm,
much most of my career, except some science, and now I do K through 5 reading coach, you know, so I'm with itty bitties now, which I love it, don't get me wrong.
mhm.
But man, does it make me miss a lot of things. And the standards are so good and the resources are so good. It makes me jelly.
Well, thank you. I absolutely understand. We've all said the whole ELA team that, if we were in the classroom now, the way that we would have done things, how we would have approached things would have been so different. And to have resources and to know that we have resources is definitely one of those key pieces. So,
I keep thinking that every single thing you've been showing would be so strong through like Socratic seminar. Like that
mhm.
keeps coming to my mind. Like how strong would that piece be with Socratic seminar added in it?
Absolutely. And so much of that can hit with our communications pieces as well. Um, absolutely. I love that you've mentioned that. So we'll go ahead and shift, like I said, um, to honor our time. And again, wherever we end is kind of wherever we'll pause, and whatever's left, I'll record. But I do want us to try and get into research and maybe see what we can do for communications as well. So it's a lofty goal, but let's see what we can do. So, research, um, our research strand is quite different in that there is a shift from general inquiry expectations, where you would have seen inquiry with 2015, to now a more explicit research process. And when we look particularly at high school, what you'll see, and I'm looking at English 1 and 2 here, just on the screen, students are going to be expected to conduct both short and more sustained research, which then allows flexibility for teachers, um, and experience with creating varied final products that fit the context of the research. So, not everything has to end in a research essay or, a research project necessarily. There are different ways that students can meet those goals. The other thing that's a little bit different about the research strand is it's one standard with 5 indicators. So as opposed to being multiple standards, there's just one, and each piece is going to be introduced as students progress. So you'll have one that's introduced in kindergarten, then you'll have one that's introduced in second grade, and then fourth grade. So that's going to be for developmental appropriateness. Same information here. When we look at English 3 and 4, short and more sustained research would be research 1.1, so that indicator 1.1. For today, I want to turn our attention a little bit more specifically to indicator 2, so research 1.2, which focuses on credibility. So, one thing that's important to note with our research standard is that students are going to gather information from a variety of sources, as we would with any sort of research. But the expectation in English 1 through 4 is for students to critically analyze and evaluate those sources and use only those that are credible and relevant to their purpose and audience, right? So we're going to gather a lot, but we might not use all of it. We're only going to use what is going to best meet our needs. Um, so students work on analyzing their sources for 3 years before they transition to evaluation in English 4. And we can look here at those definitions for analyze and evaluate. And it kind of makes sense why they would spend 3 years analyzing before they move to evaluating in English 4. Because there's just so much there for students to do as part of that analysis process, right? There are so many components. Again, it's like tracing that argument. I want to talk a little bit about an instructional practice that teachers can use to help students evaluate their sources. And again, select only those that best meet their needs and are the most credible and relevant. So the first piece here is going to be what I'm calling the 4R strategy. If you've been to any of our in-person standards trainings, you will possibly be familiar with the activity review, rank, reason. So we've taken that same idea here, where students are going to take their sources, they're going to review them using the guided questions for evaluating sources. They're going to rank them in terms of their credibility and relevance. And then they're going to share with a partner or group their reasoning for whatever that ranking is. So that's kind of those first 3 R's. But the final R is going to be the result. So students are going to share their findings and which sources they plan to use as part of whatever product it is that they're creating as a part of that research process. And it's important to note here that the guided questions, those bullet points, both of these documents are on your landing page, but the guided questions are actually a part of your research support document. So that's another support that we have here, which is on our instructional resources page, and it's on your landing page. So it's going to give you a lot of information such as types of evaluation. It's going to provide terms and definitions from our glossary as they pertain to research. You're going to have those guided questions, and there are possible grade level expectations for different aspects of research. So you'll see kind of a general expectation for English 1 through 4 for each of those components of research. So that is there for you in addition to the graphic organizer and the guided questions document. So I'll pause here, and I want you to think about, again, those shifts in expectation around research. So just what we talked about a second ago about research. And I want you to consider how those shifts could impact teacher planning and instruction, student grade level learning outcomes, and then more broadly, college, career, and military readiness. I would love to see in the chat how you think those shifts in research from a general inquiry to a more explicit process with those steps, with the short and more sustained research, with pulling a variety of sources, but only using those that are most impactful. How do you think that's going to impact teacher planning, student learning outcomes, and then that overall goal of college, career, and military readiness? And feel free to just pick one of those. The time and planning is going to be different because you're working on that analysis piece for 3 years. Hopefully makes the planning much easier, less time consuming. And hopefully those supports, also the research support document or some of those graphic organizers, help to alleviate some of that additional planning as well. Absolutely. And thinking about that evaluating sources piece where we're looking at the credibility, students don't have to use every single resource that they gather, right? They really have to become much more intentional about what they select and why they select it. Oh, I love what you said, Martina. Research is more aligned with what students will encounter in post-secondary scenarios. More time to spiral, absolutely. By jumping into communications and the top 10 noticings. So starting out with the modes of writing, this may not seem at first like it is a shift because communication 1, communication 2, communication 3 are going to be quite similar to writing 1, writing 2, writing 3 in the 2015 standards. Each is addressing argumentative writing, informative and expository writing, and then narrative writing. So there's not a shift there in terms of what the modes actually are, but there are some shifts within those modes that are helpful to point out. The first being that the modes of writing are more clearly articulated and streamlined in the 2023 standards. So in both 2015 and 2023, you will see an overall expectation for writing in one of those three modes. And underneath that is going to be those sub indicators that hit each of those individual portions of that expectation that gets us to the overall written piece. But in terms of streamlining and a more clear articulation, you'll see some things like grammar and conventions and revision and editing, which were previously embedded in those modes and at times only embedded in certain modes of writing. Now those expectations have been pulled out and are separate standards and indicators. So you'll see more of a focus on that process for those individual modes. And then separate from that will be the expectations for grammar and conventions overall and for revision and editing, which we call improving writing. When we look at the high school level with our three modes of writing, one of those sub indicators is to establish a tone and style that is appropriate to the purpose, task, and audience when writing in the three modes. So this is a little bit different in that there's a focus on intentionality. So students need to be intentional in the choices that they make about their tone and their style when they are writing, and making sure that those choices are appropriate for the purpose, the task, and the audience, which is important to know because when you look at the communication standards 1, 2, and 3, you're not going to see a standard that says that the product has to be an essay. While an essay, of course, is one of the end products that a student could produce as part of their process, it's not the only. So when they establish whatever that product is going to be, they want to then have a tone and style that are appropriate for that purpose, that task, and their audience. So all of that intentionality comes together in the choices that the student makes. One other major noticing for high school, and particularly starting in English 2, is Communication 3, which is our standard for narrative writing. Beginning in English 2, students are asked to incorporate narrative into other modes of writing. So whereas in previous grade levels, students were writing standalone narrative pieces, now they are invited to and challenged to take those narrative pieces and incorporate them into argumentative pieces or into informative or expository pieces. So that complexity then moves up compared to where they were in previous grade levels and where they were in 2015 with writing standalone narrative pieces. One instructional practice that can support authentic writing in all three modes would be the use of micro, mini, and macro writing experiences. So, how do we ensure students have adequately experienced writing in all three modes and have mastered the skills within all three modes? We want to give them a variety of experiences writing in those three modes. We don't want to just save the writing to the end of a unit. So we've called this micro, mini, and macro experiences and giving students access to each of those experiences across the three modes. So a micro experience would be something that a student could write in less than one class period. It could even be 5 minutes, right? But a micro experience with writing in that particular mode. Next, we have mini experiences, which are experiences in writing that take 1 to 2 class periods. So something a little bit more intensive, maybe something that does pull from a text or have them refer to a text, and then a macro experience. So that would be a culminating product and what we might think of as a traditional kind of end of unit written product. That could be your essay, your project, something that's going to be much more incorporating of skills that have been learned over time. So providing a variety of these experiences will allow students to master the concepts within those modes and those sub indicators as well. We do have support upcoming specific to writing at the secondary level. So in the speaker notes of this presentation and on your landing page, you have a link to our summer webinar registration. And you will see beginning May 28th, we are starting a series on writing for secondary, starting with a session on micro, mini, and macro through the 3 modes of writing. So we will talk about what micro, mini, macro are, kind of an overview of shifts in writing, and get a little bit of a taste for what those could look like across the 3 modes. Then starting the first week of June, we are moving into the 3 modes of writing. We'll have a session on argumentative writing, followed by a session on informative writing, and then a session on narrative writing and using narrative within the other 2 modes. We will finish off the writing series with a session on grammar and conventions, which is communication 4, and then a session on improving writing, so our revision and editing, and that's going to be communication 5. So we're hitting the first 5 communication standards through this secondary writing summer webinar series. We do still have that registration open if you're interested in joining. Again, you can access the link in the speaker notes of this presentation and on your landing page. Speaking of communication 4.1, one of the sessions that we're hosting is going to be on grammar and conventions. And a noticing for our shifts in grammar and conventions is that grammar and conventions expectations have been heavily revised for developmental appropriateness. So while there are many concepts in grammar and conventions that students are learning over time, you'll see that those skills are introduced intentionally at specific grade levels to support learning over the course of the student's K-12 education. So I'm showing you here one example of English 1, where you can see those sub-indicators with the individual expectations that A through F of what students are working on at that particular grade level. And that changes with each grade level to the point where they have learned each of the skills under one of those umbrellas, like capitalization. They've learned each of those concepts for capitalization, and now they're just applying the overall rules once they hit a certain grade level. One way that we can look at this is through our grammar and conventions matrix, which is our support for communication 4.1. So what this is going to do is it's going to take each of those individual skills that you see in those sub-indicators for each grade, and it's going to put it in a matrix format. So you can see each of the concepts, and you can see the grade level at which it is introduced. Now keep in mind, we say that's where the skill is introduced. That doesn't necessarily mean it's where the learning stops. We would want to ensure that students have mastered those skills over time, but that indication there is going to be the first time students have accessed or had experience with that particular concept. So this allows for intentional instruction as well as support, knowing that there may be some places where you go back and see that there are gaps in that learning, or there may be a need to go back and address certain skills to get students to where they need to be at their particular grade level. So it is a tool for instruction and it's a tool for support. So I want you to think a little bit about how this could support your work, whether you are in a classroom providing instruction to students, or maybe you're at a district level or a coaching level where you're providing support for those teachers. So consider the ways that this tool could be used to support either instruction or planning or both. And while you're thinking about that, I want to note here that the Grammar and Conventions Matrix is on your landing page, and it is posted on the instructional resources page on our SCDE website. So you have a couple ways you can access it. Additionally, when we think of instructional practice for grammar, there are a few things that we might consider maybe not a best practice, but a better practice that we wanted to share. So ensuring that students have mastered those skills in an authentic way. The first would be to teach that grammar with authentic writing. So to make grammar instruction stick, you want to connect it to students' writing. introducing those concepts as students reach the editing stage of their writing projects, and that way they can apply the concepts in an authentic context. Next would be to focus on usage over terminology. Research has shown that teaching grammar as an isolated set of terms and rules to memorize isn't effective. We want students to be using those actively in their writing, in their speaking, and not just know what it is, but why and how. Next is to teach and assess one skill at a time. We don't want to inundate students with a set of rules and practices or overload them with lots of skills all at once, but instead be intentional about introducing, instructing, and assessing each one at a time. And this may seem daunting if you see a lot of sub indicators at your grade level, but just again, it's about that intentionality and focusing mainly on one, maybe two concepts as you're going through your instruction. Next is to scaffold learning through practice and application. So again, start small. Have students practice those skills within individual sentences, and then move through to where they can practice and finish in a bigger written piece. Engage with high interest mentor texts. So, we've seen a couple of examples here as we've talked about application of skills. We've pulled a couple of texts or articles or links and things like that. But this is really where your high quality instructional materials also come into play. So, looking back at your resources to pull some of those mentor texts to engage students. Model concepts. As always, we want to, you know, model each of these for students because students really benefit from seeing particularly grammar, punctuation, and usage in action. Emphasize sentence combining. So sentence combining exercises can lead to improved writing. This is going to hit not only part of your communication 4, but also your communication 5 on improving writing. And this is something that we'll talk about a little bit more in depth in our summer webinar series. Lastly, don't mark every error. It can be very tempting as a teacher when you get a piece of student writing to go in and mark every single thing that's wrong. But it does students little good, and it's gonna divert your attention from the content of whatever their writing is. So instead, focus on one or two skills that you've intentionally practiced as you're looking at those individual pieces. And if you notice a recurring error, then that's an opportunity to go back and reteach. But don't feel like every piece of writing needs to have a mark for every single error. And again, just be intentional about what you choose to focus on and really what you're assessing at that particular time. Communication 9.1. Communication 9.1 is focusing on evaluating ideas. And so the expectation is for students to evaluate and critique ideas interactively through listening and speaking. And it's been heavily revised again for that developmental appropriateness. So let's look here at the progression for 2023. What you'll see here is moving from English 4 down to English 1. We're starting to focus on the biases that a speaker may have when we're evaluating their ideas, the effectiveness and validity of the information, any logical fallacies that may be present, and again, the style and how that style is appropriate for their audience. And think back to what we said about the modes of writing and how the style and tone for your task, purpose, and audience in student writing is also at these high school grade levels. So students are doing it in their own writing, but they're also seeing it and thinking critically about it in the presentations of others. There are many options for presentations that students can review to master these skills. Um, that could include digital media, audio, video, live presentations, printed transcripts of presentations. All of that is outlined within the standards. And I'm just pulling one example here, but it is a video recording and transcript from Fred Rogers' 1969 Senate statement on PBS funding. So this is just one that you could look at. But it's important for students to have access to multiple examples in multiple formats, because this helps them to better understand how those choices about how information is conveyed is just as impactful as what information is conveyed. So we're not going to watch this video, but it is there for us to talk about the instructional practice that comes next. So one way that students can take that presentation, take that recording, take that audio, and evaluate it would be through what I've called a SAMI chart. SAMI standing for speaker, audience, message, and impact. So inviting students to think about each of these key pieces and how then it leads to the impact. And some of these questions or prompts or invitations you'll see are going to connect again back to some of that new language in the standards. So for example, under speaker, the very last bullet, what opinions or biases does the speaker have in regard to their message? So they're thinking about the perspective of the speaker and where there might be some potential biases in whatever their message is. For audience, consider how the audience reacts to the speaker's message. Moving into the message itself, how is it shared? So what is the medium that they've chosen and why? And then again, moving into the impact, what is the result? What could the speaker have done differently? And is their presentation effective or ineffective? Now we're moving into that evaluation and critique of that particular presentation. So a SAMI chart could be one way for students to evaluate a presentation and a speaker's message. That then leads us to clarity and closure. One thing that I would invite you to do is what I'm calling here a compass reflection, where each direction on our compass would be a different reflection. So for north, we have the N for next steps. E for east would be excited about. S for south would be saving for later. So maybe there's um, a, a strategy here or a support that you might go back and save for later. And then finally, wondering. So questions you may have, considerations. And again, thinking about it in the categories of planning, instruction, and assessment, which is how we started our session. Our purpose, again, for today was to provide a lens for recognizing the most noticeable shifts, additions, and clarifications in our ELA standards for English 1 through 4. I invite you to consider if we have met our purpose for today. I hope we have. Hope we've provided a little bit of a clearer understanding of some of those noticing, some of those additions, and given you a lens to look through. The last piece here, as always, is our feedback form. The feedback form is linked in the speaker notes of your presentation, and it is on the landing page. We always appreciate any feedback that you provide, as we take that into consideration when we are making adjustments to our presentations, whether that's in terms of content or the delivery. We do really want to make sure that what we are doing is as relevant and actionable to the field as it possibly can be, so we can support teachers and student learning. You'll see here, Casey Prince Harvey, that is me. I'm the presenter. My email address is on this slide if you ever have any questions. The QR code is here as well. And the title of this session, once again, was the top 10 noticings for E1 through E4. If you ever have any questions, please feel free to reach out. But other than that, I think we are closing out for today. And I thank you so much for watching. Bye.